Hi, this is an additional video to my original Ratchet and Clank Series creative retrospective, first released exactly 1 year ago today in February 2020. The link is in the description below if you've not seen that original work, and the game spoken about in this extra video today has been reviewed in a similar style. People wanted to know why Nexus wasn't in the original video, and wanted to know what I thought of it, so here's a video about Nexus. I'd suggest watching the full series retrospective first, but please enjoy this additional video as well. Thank you. Ratchet and Clank Into the Nexus was released in 2013, 4 years after A Crack in Time, and is purple, so it's obviously a girl game. It's also the third annual Ratchet game in a row after two previous games, Ratchet and Clank All for One, a 4-player cooperative arcade shooter, and Ratchet and Clank Full Frontal Assault, a 1 or 2-player tower defense game in the style of Ratchet and Clank, released with cross-platform play between the PS3 and the PS Vita as well, if you remember that piece of tech. Wikipedia either lies or no one authoritative enough has clarified, but because Nexus treats these two games as canon in the story, making references to them and their villains, these two titles were themselves not really spin-offs, but were sequels to A Crack in Time, while Nexus is the next traditional single-player Ratchet game. It's still unclear, but Nexus was apparently the fourth and final entry into the Ratchet and Clank Future saga, which included Tools of Destruction, Quest for Booty, and A Crack in Time, but in Australia, my home country, this series isn't called the Future Saga, and I've never seen Into the Nexus referred to as a future game, so again, it's kind of unclear. It's also substantially shorter than Tools and Crack in Time, containing only 3 full levels, a Crystal Collection planet and a Gladiator arena. It also carries forward no plot threads from A Crack in Time, and is nowhere near as ambitious or sentimental, and it also ends openly. This is weird, and we'll get into this in a minute, but let's back up a little bit and deal with the obvious. Will I be talking about the two canon multiplayer entries? No. I am a single-player gamer, and I gravitated toward the original Ratchet series both as a player and as someone who likes to talk about games because of elements in its single-player design that these two games do not employ. I think because of that, featuring discussion about them in relation to the single-player games isn't only something that I'm not interested in doing, it would also be inherently unfair to them and not the best way to assess their quality in their chosen genres. I've played them and they're fine, but I'm not going to talk about them today or in the future because I just am not interested in analyzing multiplayer design. But I'm also here to be honest with you, so let's get to the more important, obvious question. Are these kinds of games, multiplayer, cross-platform, shorter games, the direction I wanted the series to go in? No. Is this the direction I think the series should have gone in? Not a chance. Were these games developed under corporate mandate? You bet your ass they were. Do I really consider any of them to be actual sequels to A Crack in Time? Obviously not. And is A Crack in Time still, to me, the last Ratchet and Clank game? Yes. I do not want my annoyance at how the second 11 years of Ratchet and Clank's lifespan resembles a slow, economically piloted tailspin into the sand to dominate my commentary. I don't know what economic factors forced Insomniac to keep making Ratchet games after A Crack in Time, but they've made enough of them for that to have been a trend and for it to define the series' output for basically 10 years. Rift apart, I don't want to judge games based on marketing, so I'm not going to talk about it, but if I have to say it looks similar, but I can talk about Nexus. That I can do, because a few people have asked why Nexus wasn't in the original retrospective. The short, brutal truth I could try to dress up nice was just that I don't lose anything from the series by excluding it, because the series gains nothing by having it. Its lack of ambition is representative of the underestimation of how far this series really could have continued to go. So yes, no matter how hard I try, I have to confirm that no, I don't treat it as part of the Ratchet mainline series because then I have to treat these 2 games as part of the mainline series as well, and I'm just so disappointed that my interest in the series dropped so quickly when I was still in the very center of the core audience for Ratchet and Clank when these games were released. My lack of interest felt important at the time. There has not been a fully blooded Ratchet and Clank game since 2009. I consider that a fact. None of these games have been fully committed to creatively, properly funded or artistically led, and each has a major aspect of it which stops it from standing shoulder to shoulder with the mainline series and its mission to improve on the previous entries without disregarding what came before. The new games are either multiplayer, 4 hours long, a movie tie-in developed for handheld technology required by Sony to make, or several of those at once. And more importantly, none of them carried on the emphasis on story and larger universes that Crack did so well. Everything Crack did was disregarded. There hasn't been a fully blooded Ratchet game since 2009. So if you really want to know why Nexus wasn't in my original retrospective, that's why. Because I wanted to end the retrospective on as positive a note as I could, because I don't feel like being nice to Nexus. I'm gonna be a little mean to it. But it should be clarified that for the circumstances under which this game was developed, it is absolutely fine. This is the 10th game of this IP that sentence is applicable to. At what point do compromises on creative projects start to outnumber the victories you had? And given that Nexus is inarguably the first regressive entry of the series, even under development pressure, the exactness of its shortcomings I would like to address. So take my Ratchet 3 segment as what happens when I give the game the benefit of the doubt, and Nexus as the opposite, because the constraints that may have been imposed upon this project don't seem to have been embraced by the project. This is not a smaller Ratchet and Clank game, it's just a shorter one. Those constraints have not been repurposed into the heart of the experience. Crack proved that the series could go beyond being good enough, and Nexus rescinds on that idea. If you keep going that way, you get James Bond. Over 20 entries, but only one film that's actually good. When does it come time to stand on the digs and look at what you have and go, we don't have the resources to make this? And if we're not able to make something as good as Crack, how do we make something unique? And if we tried that twice already and it didn't take, we can't do a half measure. I think that moment came and Nexus let it go. I don't know why it didn't take. I don't know what Insomniac were facing here. And Nexus might be fine considering those pressures, but I'm past considering. I think it'd be patronizing. I think it'd be disingenuous. And then they also released a lukewarm movie and a tie-in game under equally, if not more, dire crunch 3 years later. So I'm gonna be a little mean to Nexus, because being good enough isn't good enough, and it knows it. Now, I'll give credit where it's due. Insomniac make great games. Their output is consistently excellent. But boy howdy, can you tell when you're playing a game that they didn't want to make. So, putting aside what I wanted the series to do, let's look at Nexus on its own 2 feet. What's going on here? What's it about? What's the premise? Here's what I could glean of the game's premise. The game has an overall habit of not really explaining what's going on. It kind of just drops you in. And given that I've skipped 2 games of story to get here, that's possibly partly my fault as well. I believe there are some comics and a prequel mobile game, which may elaborate on some of this, so I won't go too hard at it, but here's what I can gather from what's said in this game, even if it's somewhat sparse. So Clank and Ratchet, along with Kronk and Zephyr from Tools of Destruction, and Tau and Apogee on a different planet, are acting as a bit of a leg for the Polaris Defense Force in a big old spaceship, and are transporting Vendra Prog, a space witch kind of terrorist person, to prison because she did some bad. Her unexplained psychic powers enable her to disrupt the ship's power supply, and the new use of gravity boots to transfer between separate grav ramps is introduced here while Ratchet does some ship maintenance. Soon after, Vendra's brother, Nefton Prog, along with a force of hired mercenaries, attacks their cruise ship, destroying it, freeing Vendra, and killing Kronk and Zephyr. Ratchet and Clank manage to escape death and stow away on one of the thug ships, eventually landing at an orphanage on planet Yerrick where Nefton and Vendra were actually raised. Through some environmental storytelling and some audio logs, it's explained here that Vendra and Nefton aren't really that different from Ratchet's situation as the last Lombax in Polaris. with Neftin and Vendra having initially been children from another dimension who were left in this galaxy by their parents. Having lived in this dimension for too long, and due to the volatile nature of their original home, the Netherverse, their bodies have grown accustomed to the physical nature of this dimension and can't return home to the Netherverse because their bodies won't allow it. So instead, they've been over the course of their lives wearing the dimensional barriers between this dimension and the Netherverse thin, and are now trying to use a homemade Dimensionator to truly bring their Nether friends, including their leader Mr. I, through to their dimension to be together with their true people. But they do this by being criminals, so Ratchet and Clank are like, that's no good. Ratchet and Clank try to head off Neftin and Vendra's attempts to use their own homemade Dimensionator on planet Psylocke, a planet they've more or less caused to be abandoned through their psychic machinations. After Mr. I is brought through, it turns against Vendra for some reason and imprisons her in the Netherverse. Neftin, after this, agrees to help Ratchet and Clank seal the Nethers back in the Netherverse using the original broken but to be fixed Dimensionator. Ratchet says, yeah bro, I'll help you get your sister back because it's fully dangerous for her to live in the Netherverse, she'll catch a cold or something, but you gotta go to jail, go directly to jail and miss out on your 200 if you want my help. And Neftin's all like, yeah righto, sounds good. So then they go and do that. Clank has a few sections peppered throughout the game where he walks through the Netherverse and coaxes a Nether to try and break through a dimensional barrier, which can destroy walls in Ratchet's path as well. They're fine, I won't really be talking about them. But before I get into actual story dissection, I do want to turn quickly to the gameplay. So let's do that. Much of Nexus contains ideas that we've seen before in the series in some form or another, and there's a bit of a sense of unity in the way these ideas are executed thanks to the elimination of vehicles, which streamlines the process and often combines several of them together. In many ways, both with gameplay and with story, Nexus feels like a greatest hits Ratchet and Clank game, featuring in some way something that was unique to each individual game along the way, to make up what Nexus is. You've got the Dimensionator and a story very reminiscent of Tools of Destruction's larger arc. It also features a Raritanium upgrade system like Tools had as well. You've got a return of the Thugs for Less mercenary group from Ratchet 2, and the aerial jetpacks seen in Ratchet 2 are combined with combat here as well, which in turn ends up being very similar to the hovercraft sections in Ratchet 3, and then combine that with a Kraken Times hoverboot designed levels and movement for the Crystal Collection, which was also in Ratchet 2. Combat is a lock-strafe affair very akin to how Deadlocked did things. Talwyn makes a reappearance and works alongside Ratchet like in Quest for Booty, and there's also light environmental traversal puzzles like Quest featured centrally too. Even Ratchet 1 gets a few shoutouts with an infobot appearing early in the game, and this brief hoverbooting through traffic section, which to me feels aesthetically like a shout out to the grind boots, specifically in the style of Ratchet 1. There's also this area here on planet Psylocke, which feels a tiny bit like Full Frontal Assault's tower defense thing and an area that you need to defend. As for what Nexus adds of its own, it includes a grav tether gadget to create some very Portal 2-esque gravity tunnels and some more emphasis on using the gravity boots within combat or running sequence circumstances at the very start and very end of the game. It is a mistake, I would say, to assume this game deals with gravity centrally. It doesn't. It flirts with the idea on a surface level, but its incredibly high octane opening shows as much depth as these ideas will ever contain. And by the end of the game, you're using zero gravity, hopping across a bunch of planets to destroy a mock bio-obliterator like that's a good use of the mechanic or my time. The game is generously about 4 hours long. It really only contains 3 levels with 2 additional levels for padding, including a gladiator arena section, which didn't need to be here, and a crystal collection section just shoved in here like a square peg in a bit of a round hole. But it's got something from every Ratchet game, hits on all the notes that one in the series typically would, wraps up kinda quickly, and that's the game. Now this can go one of 2 ways. Particularly if you're a long-time fan of the series, you might love this kind of referential design and bask in how elegantly it's all woven together within a short amount of time. Like a short burst of extremely high quality, a roller coaster that doesn't get old. Nothing takes up too much time, nothing's that poorly implemented, and the game contains a ton of variety as a result. You can enjoy that, you can go that way, or you can go the other way, by looking at this game as a shallow reflection of iteration, barely expanding on any of its own ideas to any level of depth or potential, and instead of creating anything consistent and interesting from scratch, drawn from its narrative, like every previous single-player game in the series did, it carbon copies what made the previous games interesting, and fails to commit to a real creative angle and scrapes by on nostalgia instead. I can see why people would enjoy this game. I really can. Trust me, I can. I've played this game a fair few times, and for full disclosure, when I was originally considering putting it in my larger retrospective, at times I thought this was a contender for one of the better entries in the series on whole. It's a solid game, I can understand, but today, I'm gonna go with the second one, because I don't feel like being nice. All of this is epitomized in the short museum section on Planet Igliak, a straight line through which you carry a little robot who tells you about other, more interesting games that I've already played, and makes them sound boring somehow. But let's stay on track. The highlight of Nexus is, without a doubt, its arsenal of weapons. So let's reel them all off, shall we? You've got the Omni Blasters, dual-wielded blasters, lots of fun, very reminiscent of Deadlocked, and I like them a lot. You got the Fusion Grenade, a fairly standard bomb glove. The Temporal Repulsor is an energy shotgun, which can be upgraded to blast enemies backward in slow motion, kind of suspending them in stasis, which is very, very cool. The Nightmare Box, a scary jack-in-the-box which bursts out frightening enemies, draws their ire, explodes smaller enemies with an AoE, freezes some foes in place, and can also spit acidic goo at them. Mr. Zircon is back, the classic AI sentient little robot man who hovers over your shoulder shooting stuff. The sniper weapon included is the return of the Plasma Striker, with a special scope that highlights sensitive areas. The Winter Riser is Nexus's Morpho Array. It changes enemies into snowmen or other Christmas adjacent products. The Vortex Grenade is a bit of a rift inducer type weapon, which looks a lot cooler. The Nether Blades is a nether flavored twist on Buzz Blades, which are pretty cool. The Warmonger is this game's rocket firing RPG. The netherbeast I will talk about in a moment, and the Rhino 7 is this game's Rhino, which is a bit more of a medium range gun, which fires a volley of explosive rockets at targets in an arc. Just a general word on the arsenal of this game. Not only is the collection of weapons available to use in Nexus probably the best overall arsenal featured in a single Ratchet and Clank game, each of its versions of the staple weapons like shotguns, decoy dummies, or standard blasters are strong competitors for the best iteration on each of those types. It's not just that the whole package is extremely good, it's that every gun individually is extremely good. Yeah, I'll just go ahead and say it. The best guns in Ratchet and Clank are in Into the Nexus. Things like the Nightmare Box. I think it's genius because of its multifunctionality and its design. I love this thing. It's similar to a classic weapon seen throughout the series occasionally, the Decoy Glove. The Nightmare Box feels like a combination of the Decoy Glove with a Bomb Glove type weapon since it has an AoE explosive effect, but also a mini turret or Agents of Doom type weapon, continuing to attack foes while it's out in the open. It also freezing foes in place in a scared, immobile state is a different twist on the Groovatron gun as well, which would force people to dance and leave them open to damage. It not only serves a bunch of purposes from previously separate guns, it's also an incredibly unique idea and aesthetic design for a gun in Ratchet and Clank. There isn't any other weapon with a scary theme to it like this in the whole series, and I think that's really awesome. The Vortex Grenade is a similarly multifunctional idea combining the Magnet Launcher with the Rift Inducer, and is in line with the Nether theme as well. Doesn't hurt that it's pretty powerful too. Now, I've typically steered away from these kinds of weapons in the previous games. I focused more on the damage output side of the arsenal. And that Nexus managed to make these kinds of guns way more interesting and viable to me after 7 games of not really using them all that much speaks to how much imagination is going on here. I think it really pays off. Like in Tools of Destruction though, I don't really love the Raritanium upgrade system. It feels like it makes upgrading the weapons through use less consequential. And since there's quite a few guns here for the game's short runtime, the The Raritanium feels like it pads out the progression of the weapons a little too much. You'll need to play the game 4 or 5 times to get every gun to its top level, and there's no need to do that. Having said that, bolt collection is at a pretty good rate in this game, making transactions fair and keeping expensive things feeling expensive, but not hampering you from buying new guns when you would like to. Using the crosshair and lock strafe would have been necessary given how centrally the game features aerial combat, where obviously you don't want combat on the ground to feel significantly different to combat in the air when it's still Ratchet the entire time. I think that smoothness has been achieved. It takes a bit of getting used to using the L1 button to aim instead of holding R2 to strafe and ready the wrench, but it pays off. I really enjoy the combat in this game, quite a lot. However, deadlock stages were constructed so that most of the time enemies would be attacking you from the front, and it had the companion warbots to point out enemies who were off screen, since lock strafe means that spinning around is going to happen less. So Nexus suffers while in circular arenas where enemies can approach you from behind, because you have no way of seeing them before you get hit. And then there's the netherbeast. You might have to indulge me here a little bit. But the netherbeast is a nether creature equipped to Ratchet's arm. It's a weapon in the game, which he commands with different gestures to attack enemies ahead of him, kind of like a puppeteer. If he swipes his hand forward, the nether will shadow his movement and bite an enemy going in the same direction that Ratchet's arm is moving. It feels like a mid-range weapon, but can basically do any distance you need. It's not extremely powerful, but it's not weak either. It's a very well-balanced, effective, original weapon for the game. And if you've seen my original retrospective, you might remember that I really enjoy the melee firearms in the Ratchet series, like the Plasma Whip and the Razor Claws. I just love them, and I missed them a lot in A Crack in Time. And I think the netherbeast fills a really strange, unexpected spot in the arsenal that I didn't even know was there to be filled, in that it does both. It feels like both. It functions like a gun, but it feels like a melee firearm because of how Ratchet commands the beast to attack. So the netherbeast is, in my opinion, while counting Nexus in the equation, my favorite weapon for the whole series. I really love the Razor Claws, and of the main 7, that's absolutely my favorite weapon, but the netherbeast just does it all. But I love it so much that I think there was potential here with the netherbeast to possibly theme the entire game around. I really think this idea is so strong. This isn't the first time that Ratchet has used creatures or robots as weapons or allies in the series, but I don't think it's been done quite this well before. Now, I've never expanded on it, but I'm not a fan of Mr. Zircon, despite how often he's featured in the series, because it brings up questions, right? He is a robot, and Clank is also a robot. How are they different? Why is Zircon a weapon and Clank is a person? I will question player fantasy all day long, but I am not Brian David Gilbert. I do not have time for Mr. Zircon. But what I think makes the netherbeast, another weaponized creature, different, and such a potential idea, is that this appears to be a cooperative relationship. They and Ratchet work together physically. They demonstrate a kind of symbiosis even. And the netherbeast enables Ratchet to do combat things, like Clank allows Ratchet to do movement things. While Ratchet is wearing the netherbeast, their animation, their design, his stance, and this idea, I can't help but look at this and see a third character. While I'm using the netherbeast, this is a trio. And the kicker is, since the netherbeast is themed after the netherverse, you know, like Clank interacts with them in his levels, the story involves nethers as the villains, the weapon is informed by the story, so you can inform the story with the weapon. That's kind of how the Great Clock worked in a simplified way. The objective was the location, but the location's function was also the theme. Now, you're pretty close to repeating the perfect process of cyclical narrative design like you did for Crack. The next step is to make the gun a character. The main argument I see against the new wave Ratchet games, on a narrative side at least, is that Clank and Ratchet's development is basically finished. They've fought to be better friends and they've fought to find each other again, but without a source of conflict in that titular relationship, the games have struggled to find a central driving force for plot. Well, maybe it was worth considering, since they're already finished evolving, adding a third character to the mix, making the netherbeast the new combat companion, and informing the design of the combat with more character, like the whole series has involved Clank's progression in the movement and puzzles. When you equip Clank with a helipack, that changes the way that environments can be designed and how Ratchet can move. Giving him a solo mission does the same thing. There's a way to do similar things, add similar augmentations to a third companion to achieve combat functions and changes throughout the game instead of movement potential. And the more I think about it, the more I look at the Warmonger, just another rocket launching weapon, and then the netherbeast, a living, moving, breathing, dynamic and original weapon idea, the less crazy I think this sounds. Inform the combat with the character. That's a whole damn game. I'd play the shit out of that. So returning to what the premise and the story of the game actually is, instead of this cool idea, the explanation I gave of the dimensions and realities is probably a little messy to hear, because the use of different realities is pretty unique, or a slightly rarer concept than I think is given credit. I like that, so it's actually a lot easier to follow in the game than I'm probably making it sound. There's a difference between altered dimensions and different galaxies in my head that I know when I was younger was a little hard to pass. It has a lot in common with the Tachyon story from Tools, to simplify, a prince of the Cragmites who wanted to recall his race to the Polaris galaxy after being separated himself. And there's a risk here, given now that this story has basically been told 4 or 5 times in the series, what with Tachyon, Ratchet, Vendra, Azimuth, and Clank to an extent, all being examples of this exiled mindset searching for belonging. But I think the emotional angle that Nexus takes, showing Vendra in relation to Ratchet, is an interesting enough angle for that repetition not to be as apparent or annoying as it might have been. However, the story is underwhelming. The opening is brilliant, but the inclusion of the obligatory Crystal and Gladiator stuff slowly contributes to a loss of focus over the game's runtime, and it eventually feels like a very different story than the one it started as. The game doesn't have a lot of time to tell it. I don't think it focuses on the right aspects as it moves along. I don't think it designed levels that told that story really well and kept it to its smaller scope. I think it should have stayed focused on Vendra and Ratchet rather than the larger Nether threat, but I want to shout out 2 particular highlights all the same. The first is that James Arnold Taylor, as the voice of Ratchet, does a fantastic job. When he's in control of the scenes, he's really in control. Nefton and Vendra actually put Ratchet in some emotionally interesting positions, and I not only really enjoyed the way the Ratchet was written to respond, but loved how Taylor acted them out. For example, I don't really care about Kronk and Zephyr. I'm not bothered by their loss, and I wasn't motivated to invest in the story for that reason, but Taylor really sold Ratchet's reaction to it with the perfect emphasis. I cared about this because Ratchet was sad about it, which for me is pretty difficult to pull off, and it felt like it really emotionally rounded out Ratchet as a character in this game in a very, very short amount of time. I also think Nika Futterman did a really solid job as the voice of Vendra. Vendra as a villain isn't teased out and is overshadowed by Mr. I at the end, but initially her character is the most interesting part of the game. She's the first female villain that we've seen in the series, and she has this spooky aura that injects a brand new sense of imagination into the game early on. It fades as her character is sidelined, but Futterman does a really great job conveying the character all the same, again, in a really short amount of time. A special shout out goes to the one audio log of a young child Vendra. I have a soft spot for this kind of voice acting, and I really, really enjoyed it.
Miro Orphanage. Bunch of creeps and bullies. All they do is pick on Neff and me. And when I tell one of the teachers, I get sent to detention. But I made a new friend today. I call him Mr. I, and he lives in the caves where my brother and I were found. He doesn't pick on me. He says he's my friend, and he says he has big plans for us.
I do, however, think that for as many moments of really solid voice acting as there are, there's one of equal carelessness. The amount of low-pitched and nondescript additional voice acting used for the Thugs for Less enemies gets tiresome at best, which unfortunately also includes Nefton Prog, whose voice I think was fully the wrong idea, especially given that he's supposed to be a more sympathetic character. I've got another real soft spot for characters whose voices don't match their bodies and kind of subvert that expectation a little. Clank does this, he's one of my favorite examples of this, and I think Nefton was another perfect opportunity for that. He appears to be some kind of cyborg or enhanced individual as well. This isn't his real body, so emphasizing that with an unexpected voice may have added a bit of character. As it stands, this is, I would say, probably the biggest voice acting choice that I question for the whole series, something that it's not really had trouble with before. I also didn't just not laugh at, but strongly question the implementation of the humor in this game. It feels forced in at dumb times out of obligation, and sometimes actually overrides the tone that the game is going for. This happens even at its very final moments, completely killing an already deflated story climax. I think the story of Nexus had a lot of potential as a swan song for sure, Ratchet being able to guide the way out of the darkness for two people who were lost in the same fog he was in. There's something here, it just goes in a more explosive direction at the end, and it's just fight the big glowy man. It's fine for what it is, but again, it's an adventure, not a story, and I promise to not keep harping on about how the regression from Crack's ambition in a story sense affects my read on this game. I wanted something very different, it feels like there's no use in me asking for it, but even what's here I don't think is as good as it could have been. I'm not splitting hairs here. The game does a good enough job of contextualizing the gameplay with story and making the rest of the game coherent, but that's a level of praise which is closer to labeling the game as competent rather than excellent. It's done what it has to. It's good enough, but that doesn't mean it's good. At this point, with this writer, I'm not going to congratulate an entry for basic functionality. That's expected and has been achieved. It's not a bad game or a bad story, but indifference is the most damning opinion of all. Okay, so now we get onto my big gripe, and I did promise this would happen. This one's a pretty big deal to me because I'd always noticed it, but it took me 7 years to articulate it. And it's a flaw that I think affects virtually every second of the game. I don't expect this will be a popular take, and I respect your right to disagree. But I think my problems with this thing are actually more technical, so I want to make sure that I hit on this point, because it's an unavoidable thing, but also because it goes into actual artistic and technical things that have been blundered. I think this game looks like trash. It's one of the ugliest, most careless visual escapades I've seen produced by a company of this pedigree. I'm not kidding around. This game looks like garbage. And I did not expect going back that this would be an issue, because in my mind, this game is astounding to look at. At a glance, it's a bit surprising that it's still a PS3 game and not on the PS4. In my head, I remember this game being really gorgeous. But I think that's because of simple polish techniques that have been overused and turned up to ridiculous amounts to trick you into thinking this game is really pretty, when really there's not a lot going on, and the details are so badly tuned that it legitimately tired my eyes out to play this game for extended periods of time. So I would love to praise the visuals, I really would. I expected I would be doing that. You know, I love the purple motif, and at times, yes, the game is quite gorgeous, but at just as many times, it's let down by the frame rate, and for probably the first time I've had to criticize this in the whole series, just bad art direction. There is not a clear overall visual consistency to the style in this game. There's actual evidence in-game of old designs from older games being used next to new designs. The playable characters look like they all belong in different games each, because some of them literally do, especially separate games from the villains who belong in a different set of worlds than the ones you were playing in, which belong in a different game than the weapons. There is almost zero theming of any visual asset to another kind of asset, aside from a vague pink theme on anything relating to the Netherverse. The smuggler and his ship, Kronk and Zephyr, were just dropped in here directly from Tools of Destruction with zero changes, but Ratchet looks like he belongs in a Pixar movie. The Terrachnoids are used from A Crack in Time. Talwyn is a Disney princess wearing a commoner's disguise. Neftin and Vendra are from a Coraline dark fantasy film wearing Hot Topic wings. The Thugs for Less lizards are generic as hell, basically lifting the least interesting enemy type from a game a decade earlier and pretending that adding shoulder pads and climbing axes amounts to differentiation between enemy types. I know Insomniac can do better than this. None of the characters look like they were drawn by the same people. I think most of the trick that the game pulls in making me think that it's pretty is in the opening level, which is easily the best section of the game and is quite pretty, taking place mostly out in open space with a pretty nice skybox, but it's easy to ascribe why this section is so pretty because most of the time you're just looking at Ratchet and Clank, who were designed quite well, and what surrounded them doesn't really draw attention away from that. It's controlled what you're looking at. But as soon as you move on from that environment and the game has more things on screen, the cracks start showing immediately. Usually platforming through a Ratchet level is at least marginally entertaining, but it's not the case here. I barely feel any danger in these places. The hover boots feel inorganic somehow, and if the level is designed with them in mind, it amounts to a couple of straight lines between circular arenas for combat. And if one just stops moving and looks at like the Swamp Crystal Collection level, just take a second and look at how ugly the shit is. And not in a this is a gross swamp way, I mean the entire screen is one color way. The orphanage on Planet Yerrick conveys no sense of danger and is actually a really small and simple area despite initial appearances. If it wasn't relying on the grav tether, each of its branches would only take 40 seconds to walk through. If we go to the abandoned city level on planet Psylocke, everything that isn't creating light is reflecting it, creating this gross, lifeless, pale grey tone. The sky above the Destructapalooza is just pure blood orange, and the arena itself is generic with a clear case of the game's occasional over-animating on the little cages that create enemies. Planet Igliak is probably the game's best looking area after the opening, which is largely attributable to its bigger size and its much cleaner aesthetic, and its shortcut of using statues, concept art, and snapshots from previous games in its museum section. But it doesn't suffer from the bad theming of characters, weapons, and the worlds to each other any less. If I stand in this one room with Neftin on the left, Ratchet and Clank in the middle, Quark and Pollux on the right, I'm looking at 5 characters designed for 3 different games. It's not just the art stuff, it's actually like stuff on the screen as well. I think where most of my problem with the graphics for this game originates is with the lighting. It uses bloom lighting to basically trick my brain into thinking that the game is really polished and shiny by drawing my attention away from the actual textures and the art. The reflective nature of basically every surface gives this really plastic look to the enemies and weapons. Tell me you look out into any of these planets with their overbearing one-tone colors and lighting each and feel any kind of environmental dynamic or sense of place. Because of the lighting, I can barely ever tell when fighting an enemy how far away they're supposed to be. I don't see distance in this game. But as a result of using the lighting to this degree, it'd be easy to say that this game looks good, because at times it can, but more often it's actually just overwhelming and trying to distract me with the pretty lights. It's like a commercial, but the devil's in the details. And the reason I like Obani Draco in Ratchet 3 was because the whole level was themed pink, purple, and black, and only used colors within that general palette. And Ratchet's weapons stand out on top of that theme, as do the chosen enemies, and it allows a really unique looking and feeling location to still contain a sense of clarity when it comes to the firefights. There's also a bit of an understanding in that level that it's more of just an atmospheric show and tell playground. It's meant to be kind of wow, and the combat isn't strenuous on top of that. It's playing with gravity and physical alignment and these really bright, bold colors dominating the screen, so it doesn't try to put extremely complicated combat, which relies on its own colors, on top of that already busy picture. And when it does contain a boss fight with Courtney Gears at the end of the level, the environment around her becomes way darker, both in color and in light sources, so that you can keep your attention as a player more on the lighting of the projectiles and of those moving people and things which are colored, instead of needing to deal with walls of bright hot pink slime taking up half the screen while you try and shoot something that's competing for emphasis. The Ratchet Nexus doesn't seem to pay nearly as much attention to what colors and lights are going to blend in with each other on the screen like this, especially when every anime character model is this detailed, reflective, and indistinct. Surely this isn't just me, there's too much light. Now this is really important because both of these tools, color and light, aren't just the bread and butter for an artistic team, they're also crucial in gameplay and level design. Light sources on top of lending authenticity to an environment often lead a player through a space. You'll naturally be attracted and move toward the thing that's lit most brightly in an environment. Color can also do that and can lend theming and exclusivity to a character to help them stand out in the frame, be they the player character or an enemy or whatever. And you ideally don't want a character blending into the world. You want the player to be able to decode the image easily and find their way through a space easily. You want them to know where a bullet is coming at them from. You want to highlight the most important things in the frame that the player needs to react to and keep track of. But you could basically look at any area in Nexus, point to a random thing, and ask, why does this random thing need to be so bright? And you would not find an answer. The entire image of the game also looks like it's been post-sharpened considerably, and the contrast of light and dark is also really full on. So the shadows are really black and the brights are, again, too white. The PlayStation 3 is also running this at 30 frames per second, not 60, at 720p, which means you'll have all of this extreme information being shoved through a low resolution. And all these tricks, like post-sharpening, lighting, overuse of color, might make it pretty on a first glance. If you're not playing the game for extended periods of time, or if you're not slowing down to pay attention, or if you're watching me frequently cut clips in this video, yes, Nexus is quite appealing because of its highly saturated colors, its bright lights, and its sharp detail. But while playing, you don't want looking at the game to tire you out. You don't want things on the screen to blend in with each other. You want to know where threats are coming at you from, and you want it to stand up to scrutiny. It's, again, a matter of standing on the ground in the game, looking out into an environment and feeling like it's a real location with depth and shade and movement. And I can't do that in a single spot in this game. The answer to that is not more detail, it's a unity in the kind of detail that each asset has received. It's consistent artistic design. It's looking at your light sources and asking, why is this cave wall so reflective that it's clipping? It doesn't need to do that. It's asking what needs to stand out and making everything look like it was drawn by the same hand. Why do the ammunition crates look like this in this place? The longer you play Nexus, the more you'll start to notice stuff like uncontrolled bursts of extreme lighting assaulting your eyes without rhyme or reason, seemingly photorealistic worlds matched to zany and ridiculous character designs not having any synergy with each other at all, and a degree of sharpening which actually eliminates environmental depth and shadow dynamic. It's like everything is trying to infect the whole screen with a different idea at the same time, and when two non-complementary ideas are clashing like that on a screen, it gets ugly, but it's hard to notice. I've not gone this hard against any Ratchet game's visuals before. Often I really enjoy the art in a Ratchet game. I find it very cohesive. But for Nexus, I think this is a real problem because there's only 5 levels in the game. And not only does each level feel relatively uninspired, none of them are artistically polished at all. And I get that this was probably a result of time and budgetary constraints, I understand. This was still the 3rd Ratchet game, the 3rd year in a row, I get it. I want to make it clear that I'm not blaming anybody, I'm just trying to point this out. All 3 of these games, All for One, Full Frontal, and Nexus, all have these exact same lighting problems, and it stayed the same. And for clarity, yeah, Crack in Time also made pretty laborious use of bloom lighting. Looking back, it's a little overbearing at some points. However, not once do I remember needing to stop playing a Crack in Time because my eyes had drained themselves of their fluid like I did with Nexus. And it doesn't seem as though bloom is used in Crack as anything other than for the effects to which it's suited. It's a finishing touch, not really a replacement for environmental details which are otherwise lacking. I don't think I have trouble when playing Crack actually figuring out what I'm looking at, particularly in big fights. It may not be to everybody's taste, and that's fine, but I would still argue that Crack is possessed of an extremely cohesive visual style, from worlds and weapons and NPCs. It's true that the cutscenes and the gameplay don't always match visually, but sue me, I like the realistic worlds that feel like they're moving on their own with purpose, and Nexus don't got that. Even if these places are meant to be abandoned, they're not giving off that sense either. I felt all sorts of emotions while walking through different Ratchet levels, including fear and loneliness, and I don't feel much of that while playing Nexus. But as for the visuals, is there a way to fix this? So I've gone through and I've just tried to change a few colors on my footage right here. I've decreased the sharpening, I've softened the highlights and altered the luminance of the colors. I've also changed the white balance a small amount so that the overall image is less warm. It's a small change, but to me looks a little softer, a little more muted, and a little less baked, and definitely tamed in some of those blown out highlights. Ratchet also stands out in the frame a lot more to me. Notice how there's now actual shape to his face. Notice how much more easily the light looks as though it's moving from bright to dark. It might be less punchy, but that's exactly what it needs. Fewer effects, and more places on the screen where it looks like it wasn't turned up to 11. Fancy footage color changes can't fix the overall art, however, and basically to me it looks as though the visuals of Nexus weren't under control, and there's been a lot of visual information put onto the screen at any given time without thinking about how it might relate to something else in the world. It's just messy artistic design. Things don't match, colors aren't themed, simple objects are often way too big and given unneeded amounts of detail, and the game is tiring to look at because of its careless use of bloom lighting. I just want for the worlds and characters to look like they belong to each other, and for the light to make sense. To begin concluding, and to speak on the game's length quite briefly. I've heard this game compared to Quest for Booty in its length respect quite often, a comparison which I think misses the content of both of these games quite seriously. As I explained in my original retrospective, the narrative link going from Tools through Quest and then into Crack is very significant, and the similarity in design between Quest and Tools means that Quest is basically narrative DLC for Tools of Destruction, not a full game. It features way less combat also, and focuses in on atmospherics and puzzles to make up the difference for the large set pieces that it didn't have the resources to include. It also, narratively, was a really low stakes plot. It was just about a little island and Ratchet looking for his friend. Galaxies and dimensions weren't in jeopardy, and it lent a sense of innocence, patience, and calm to the game, which helped a great deal. It really assisted the pacing. I think Nexus needed to pay more attention to how Quest made the length work, because Nexus isn't attached to a larger game, contains a really high stakes plot, so it feels way less okay to be this short. It's got enough meat here for a longer story, particularly in terms of how many guns there are, and it feels both truncated and stretched at the same time. Honestly, it kind of feels like the first version of the last 3 missions to a much longer game. The most annoying thing is that this is still a combat-focused game, and has enough of an arsenal to fit a much lengthier runtime. It's got so much variety in its game types, but so little time to do anything with it, alongside its need to keep combat in the mix, that not only does nothing receive depth, but nothing sticks around long enough for the game to feel like it actually becomes anything refined before it's over. Every level is different, which is good, but also bad, because there's no groove and consistency to what's going on. And as a result, the game as a whole doesn't feel memorable. And because of its reliance in its final level on nostalgia to drive it, ultimately feels like nothing of its own. It uses enough tools to fill a much larger game, so it feels anticlimactic when none of them go any further, whereas Quest filled the right length with the right amount of tools to use them all as much as needed, and put it within a story to which a shorter length was suited. I still basically enjoy playing Nexus somehow. The gameplay isn't just par for the course, the quality of the weapons and the use of aerial combat elevated to a unique height for the series in some very important ways. It's definitely an entry worth playing for the weapons alone. It's still fun, and you're not losing a lot in time, and it's not asking for much in terms of emotional investment. The game is not bad by any stretch of the imagination. The cutscenes are in at the right times, the story is perfectly functional, and no, I don't consider it a sequel so much as an additional episode to a larger game that never happened, but given that Crack is still treatable as the series finale, Nexus doesn't really come close to tarnishing that on its own. It's more of an epilogue, I guess. That's still probably too generous. But to speak on what creatively stands out to me about Nexus, I would like to point, kinda like I did with Crack, to the cutscenes. Take a listen to this cutscene. There's some occasional, pretty brutal audio compression going on which really draws me out of the game. It's a technical thing that not everyone's going to know how to describe, but I guarantee you, this kind of thing affects everyone's experience regardless. And I understand the need for compression on these older systems, but just take a listen to this cutscene and pay attention to the sound. Pay particular notice to when Ratchet is talking and when he says a word with an S or a T in it.
I really am sorry about Kronk and Zephyr. They were true heroes.
Thanks, Quark.
Just let it out. Let it all out. Don't be afraid to cry. That's a brave Lombax.
All right, that's enough of that. The twins are using some low-rent dimensionator. We need to make sure the real one is safe.
Not to worry. It's on display in the secure wing of the Intergalactic Museum of History. It's virtually impenetrable.
If we destroy this one, the Progs will be unable to bring over any more nethers. Ratchet, we must get to planet Psylocke.
It's like someone's chopped its head off, right? Now, when using compression in a musical sense, you're decreasing the dynamic in the original source. You're squashing it down to make sure everything is the same volume. You're pressing down on the loudest parts so that they don't stick out, so that the softest parts are just as big. But when compressing audio data files, comparing them to uncompressed files, you actually lose quality in the sound. You lose detail. If I slowly transition into a more compressed audio file while I'm just speaking right now, you might start to notice the difference. If I blossom back into less compression, you'll start to regain some of that wonderful crunch. Now, I'm an audio person. I'm a music producer, and I obviously try to pay attention to it when I make a video. And in my own time, I purchase high-resolution music that I like to listen to so that it sounds better than streaming it off a website. And the biggest difference I hear is in the high end. It's in the cymbals on the drums and the crispiness, in the S's and the T's in speech. You might think that I'd want fatter bass in my music, but what I really want is more of that crispy sibilance to lend that bass more context and give it something to contrast with. I'm looking for that detail and that dynamic that you don't get when you're just streaming it. I don't want to get too technical, but compression of an audio file needs to happen for streaming services to be able to deliver music to you. Compression of really any file just helps it take up less space on a computer by eliminating data. It'll be a smaller file size, easier to transfer, easier to burn into a disk, and easier for a machine to playback or reproduce, easier to access. But when you compress, you lose things. It gets rid of data it doesn't think it needs so that the file is smaller. And the harsher you are, the more you compress, you start to lose really important stuff that looks disposable too. You slowly but surely start to lose dynamic. You lose tenderness. And when you listen to music or sound in a cutscene, the more you compress, the less of the original art you're actually hearing, and the less you'll be able to enjoy it. whether you're aware of that or not. You don't know what you're missing out on in that sound, and you can't be affected by those things because they're just not there. I see it all the time. The thing I always hear when I play my friends a high resolution version of a song that they've listened to before, the thing they always say is, "Holy shit, I've never heard that before." It's like they're hearing it for the first time. Like the blanket that was between them and the song is now gone. It could be something they listen to every day on the radio, on Spotify, YouTube. They didn't know what they were missing from that song because it was never there. That magic that really makes it that little bit more special, the most special it can be, was deemed disposable by the compression. That experience is what you lose. And even if you've seen every one of my videos on my channel, you are seeing a file that YouTube itself compressed. The video you're watching right now has been through a round of online compression that I've done my best to work around, but has impacted my work. And you're not seeing the video that I actually made. That honestly makes me kind of sad, because I'll spend a lot of time working on it and reacting to it a certain way, only for everyone else to get a fully lesser version of that. Less high-end, less dynamic. And trust me, even if I've made something that has reached you, if you've got my master file, it's something else entirely. It's gone through so many stages before it gets to you. I'm saying this because Ratchet and Nexus feels, creatively, like the entire series was put into one game and then compressed to hell and back. Not just in terms of how short it is, but yes, in its construction, in every moment of playing it. I enjoy it, but I don't know what I'm missing out on. I might be getting versions of every major thing the series has done to some degree, but the levels are flat and they're all the same volume. The art is mismatched and careless, and someone chopped its head off. The other games are recounted, but produce no reaction from me because there's no dynamic. The Gladiator Arena is so nothing. None of the charm is there in the Crystal Collection. The story features some kind of investment that the other games often did a lot better. There's a good game here, it's made of solid pieces, but it's unrefined. And everything that it includes from a prior game, it's deemed something disposable in the process of placing it within this particular context. It's as if I'm just not seeing everything that was here. For every level or moment that I'm able to play, 2 were skipped in between. Like it was crushed down to fit into a shorter runtime than designed to fit on the right disc for a system which couldn't handle it. I don't know what's gone, but I can tell it's not all here. And that affects my experience of the game whether I'm aware of it or not. And that's technically as well as creatively. And I understand what I'm hearing. But if I want the real uncompressed audio, if I want to feel Ratchet and Clank properly, unfortunately, there's no shortcut to that. What stands out creatively is that you can't compress a bunch of ideas from elsewhere into one package and expect it to just work. And that someone can always, at the end of the day, tell. No matter how hard you tried, no matter if they realize it or not, they can tell whether or not the thing you made was something you wanted to make. And I can't think of anything more ironic.